Big change. What's that? Big change from last year.
Oh, big change. It was mountains good, yeah.
That's all right.
Exciting.
Yeah. That's what I was telling them, the sidewalks, different places. They're back.
Oh, that's good.
Exciting.
Park's pretty good. That's pretty much all we're doing.
Then we just had it dad's on Saturday.
Yeah, it wasn't a good
I
Saturday.
went to the mailbox and it was in the news. It said you don't know.
Yes, that's what he's getting.
Yeah, they didn't show our man Saturday.
So we had to drive down here. And the way going across the
Oh, that's old? Yeah, because so that county like far off, bad.
It was almost 10 minutes.
Decided to do
It was
something.
a rain.
Yeah, do something.
It's underneath, the snow was wet.
Wet.
Insulated. And when you scooped it out, now that had ice.
Yeah. No, it was
Got some cold
interesting.
air on it.
Yeah. Not with the trucks either. Hopefully your trucks weren't wrappy.
And we're getting, the weather was, there was some delays there.
Sure.
Wisconsin's one of our busy areas.
Oh, is it?
Getting people
They're
back,
used to that.
getting back through there.
Yeah.
We're just starting to rebuild.
Get back on track.
Been a busy week, that's for sure.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm doing over here. I'm like, I'm gonna say hi and then I'm like, okay.
We're closing. See, yeah, it looked like a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that'll be hard to. Yep, that's. Got the other house on there.
Yes, we did. This will be good for us.
That's good. Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock, we'll call the meeting to order. Remind everybody, if you have a cellular device, to please turn it off or put it on mute. There's a binder labeled public copy of board materials at the side of the room. A sign-in sheet is also located near the door at the side of the room. Meeting agendas are available for the public at the table at the side of the room also. And meeting agendas, materials, and minutes are also available on the district web page. Would you join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Nancy, could you take roll call?
President Sunderman.
Here.
Vice President Berger. Here. Director Boyson.
Present.
Director Honeyman.
Here.
Director Jones.
Here.
All right, that brings us to the IASB financial portion of the meeting. Clear up.
All right, well, good afternoon. We're going to talk to you about some school finance stuff. My name's Sean Snyder. I'm with the Iowa Association of School Boards. and I've been with ISB for just over 7 years now. Prior to that, I worked for the Iowa Legislature, nonpartisan legislative services agency, where I worked with both the Senate and the House, the Republicans and the Democrats, and I was the person that modeled the school aid formula for the legislature. So, you know, the governor was recommending 2.5% supplemental state aid. My job was to figure out how much that was going to cost and how the impact on each school district. I also worked 4 years at the Iowa Department of Education. At the time it was called the Bureau of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. If you've seen the Condition of Education report, that's something I worked on. If you're familiar with the BEDS data collection, that's something else I've worked on. I want to introduce Jan Miller-Hook.
Hi, I spent the last 14 and a half years at Johnston as CFO. Before that, I was at Urbandale, West Des Moines. Higher ed, I spent 15 years between Simpson and Southwestern Community College. Bank auditor, magistrate judge. And I'm pretty familiar with your area. I have a lot of roots here. My great-grandparents lived in Clarinda. My grandmother worked at your hospital and lived in your suburb, Newmarket. And then, of course, I still have aunt and uncle Herzbergs that lived here, and still have a cousin that used to run the Taylor Pharmacy, so Devin Gordon Reed. So, and Chris worked with her as a colleague at Johnston. So a lot of roots to Clarinda, and glad to be here.
All right, so kind of our agenda today is we are going to review some of the information. You should have a booklet, key financial indicators and a financial focus booklet. We're going to go through some of the slides in the booklet. And then after our presentation, Laura is going to actually go through some projections for your school district. So we're really keyed in on finance. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them at any time. So one thing I like to talk about before we really kind of get into the data is at ISB we do have board standards, and our fifth board standard is in regards to fiscal responsibility. And then for fiscal responsibility, these are 3 of the 5 financial standards that we have. So really financial health is kind of what Jan and I are going to review today. And Laura's going to take a look at financial forecasting. But the thing I want to point out is these are all interrelated. You can't have good financial forecasting unless you know what your financial health of your school district is. You can't have good budgeting unless you have good forecasting and have an understanding of what your financial health is. And you can't have good financial health unless you have good forecasting and strong budgeting. So these 3 things really interrelate, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about this afternoon.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the board role. On the left side, you can see where your role lies. Basically, the governance, the board policies, focusing on the larger issues. On the right-hand side, you can see the operational side or the administrative side. So leading the work of the organization, making decisions to implement policy, and the policy again is the board, establishing means to accomplish those ends. And then, so does it relate to the big picture? You always want to be up here. If you feel like you're in the weeds, you probably are in the weeds, and that's not your job. That's the administrative job. That's the operational piece of it. Does it relate to day-to-day activities? That would be administrative. That would be the operational. Does it have to do with setting general policy? And at that 10,000 foot, that's the board's role. Is it being analyzed and implemented at the building or classroom level? Again, that's administration. That's operations. Is it setting direction and big picture goals? So I just gave you a few examples. And I know 3 of you have been on the board for probably quite a while, and maybe 2 new board members based on the pictures. So let's say that a neighbor comes to you and wants to talk about an employee of the school district. That's one of those things where that's in the weeds. You don't want to do that. You want to refer them on to the applicable administrator, because you could very well have to sit in judgment, possibly, about that employee. Another example would be like your field trip policy. You have one of those that overrides and tells, maybe how many chaperones you have and different parameters of the field trips, but the actual where they're going, how they're doing it, that's the operational side. And then, this is a little more extreme, but say you go to a football game, something isn't working right, maybe it's the speaker system. You think there's been discussions about it, nothing's happened. You go to the AD and say the speaker needs to be replaced. Yeah, no. That's operational, that's administrative. Now you'd have a purchasing policy, so if something costs X dollars according to your policy, then that comes to the board for approval.
So like I said earlier, we are going to kind of reference some of the items that are in the book. We're not going to go through the book entirely, but we'll highlight some items. Another thing that we brought with us is a financial glossary of terms. There's a lot of terminology when it comes to school finance, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around that sometimes, even for me. So this is a good document you might want to keep handy. Just if you have, want to look for a definition of something, we'll have that information in here. So these are some of the things we're going to touch on this evening. So the first thing before we go into the data, a couple of concepts I want to talk about. First is the Dillon's rule versus home rule, and then funding silos. So it's really important to know that school districts operate under Dillon's rule. Well, what does that mean? That means that they can only do what's authorized by law or rule. So, and that's different from cities and counties. Cities and counties actually operate under home rule, which basically, if the law doesn't address it, then the cities and counties can basically do some type of broad interpretation of the authority and code. So really there is a difference. I would note that home rule is an Iowa Constitution. And there has been discussion about the legislature passed this home rule light law, I think back in 2017. So there is language in Iowa code that says that school districts can do some things in regards to home rule. However, that what they can do is very limited. And the way really to get true home rule for school districts, it would take a constitutional change. And that's a pretty heavy lift because it has to have approval from two different general assemblies, and then it would go to the vote of the people. So before we would even get home rule for school districts, it's going to take at least 4 years at a minimum before that would happen. So we do have a law that's might provide a little bit of wiggle room for school districts. Jan, are you aware of anything that districts have taken advantage of in the home rule?
The light.
Yeah. When we've gone out and talked, to districts and presented, usually this is a question we ask: is have you found a way to take advantage of this home rule light? And almost all the time the answer is no. And I actually haven't heard a district that has said they've taken advantage of this. So, and the reason is because the way Iowa law is written for school districts, it's very prescriptive. So it doesn't leave really much wiggle room for school districts to take advantage of this. So even though it is an Iowa law, really it hasn't been effective for the past 4 or 5 years that it's been in place. And if there is something that you want to take advantage of, that as a board you talk about that maybe you might be able to find something, these are things that you need to consider. What does the code language say? Does it say may or does it say shall? Can the current law be broadly interpreted? And like I said earlier, our laws have been written because of Dillon's rule. They've been very prescriptive, so there isn't a lot of wiggle room there. And again, if you try to take advantage of it, you might expect some pushback, possibly from the Department of Education, possibly from your auditor, possibly from your legislature. And then also, if you are going to try to take advantage of the law, make sure you seek an attorney's advice to make sure that it's going to be okay. So like I said, yes, there is a law that kind of provides a little bit of home rule, but really, we're not really sure how effective it is, and I'm not sure it really is effective at all. So just some information. You need to remember that school districts do operate under Dillon's rule until we get a constitutional change in the Iowa Constitution. And then another thing is, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, is school districts have a lot of different funds. Your general fund, which is in the green, that's going to represent the largest portion of your revenue. And that makes sense because that's where salaries and benefits and cost for instruction comes from. But you also have all these other funds. So the important thing to note about this is you can't mix and match. You need to think of these as funding silos. So even though you might have a large management fund balance or a large capital projects fund amount, you can't shift those funds into your general fund because the law doesn't allow it. So it's important to note, and we've been to districts where they may be building a new school building, but they're all at the same time making staff reductions. And sometimes, the general public will say, well, why can't you shift those funds from your capital projects, that stop building the building and pay for salaries? Iowa law doesn't allow that. These funds have specific purposes and they have to be used for those specific purposes. So on pages 1 through 4 for your book, We have the breakdown of all the different funds that you have. We have the revenues for each fund, the expenditures by each fund. And I just point out that the general fund, like many school districts, represents about 83% of your overall revenue. And again, that pays for the cost of operating your school district salaries and benefits are the largest portion of that. Another good tool for you is on page 4. We have this table here that shows you all the different funds, the description of the funds, where the code citation is that allows for school districts to have these funds, and then what the major revenue sources are, and then what those major expenditures are that can be used for those funds. So again, just some kind of good information, but the point here is school districts have a lot of different funds, but they all have the specific purposes, and that's important to note as well. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to kind of focus more on the general fund.
So how do we measure the financial health of a district? There are 7 different financial indicators that help us do that. The first is certified enrollment, and as you know, that's the count of your resident students taken each October 1. And that helps you determine, are you going to be viable? Do you have a stable enrollment? Do you have a declining enrollment, increasing? Budget decisions with each one of those scenarios, but very important. Unspent authorized budget ratio, that is kind of like your spending authority credit card authorization, if you will, at the end of the year. So the ISB range recommendation is 5 to 15%, and not to exceed 25%. So are you within that range? What does the trend tell you? So if your spending authority all of a sudden is declining, then you have to make adjustments. If it's stable, if it's increasing, why? Because on the other hand, if your ratio is where you want it to be, then there's a chance that maybe there's more expenditures that need to happen because we're here for students. That's why we're here. Annual unspent spending authority, that one, if your ratios are where you want to be, then you're going to hover and be around that stabilization of 0% because you're going to be spending that spending authority that comes in on an annual basis, spending that on your students. If you are spending anything into the prior year, that's where you're going to see your spending authority decreasing. And then you need to ask the question, why? For instance, if it's salary and benefits, that's something that's going to snowball because those are not one-time expenditures hitting the spending authority. Solvency ratio would be your cash side of things. So that's your snapshot at the end of the year, how much of your revenue is remaining. Again, the range is 5 to 15% is the recommendation, not to exceed 25% there. And the reason for your short-term, for your solvency ratio, more than one reason. One, if you're going out for bond any debt, that's really important when you have those bond calls. But second of all, you need to be able to manage your short and long-term cash. So June, July, August, you have no state aid coming in, you have no property tax money coming in. So you still need to be able to pay salaries and benefits and all of your other expenditures. Percent of revenue spent, that's another one that if your other ratios being your spending authority and solvency are where you want it to be, then you pretty much want it to be at 100% so that the revenues coming in are being spent on your students in education. Salaries and benefits, the ISB recommendation is 75 to 82%. We are a people business. Most of our expenditures are in this area. And then you want to stabilize and you want to make sure that you can sustain. And then the last one, the new money percent. So you have the state supplemental aid each year that's determined by the legislature, and then your enrollment. So if your enrollment is increasing, then your new money is more than SSA. If your enrollment is decreasing, of course it's less. Your settlement percentage, what did you settle at? And hopefully, this is getting harder and harder to do with low state supplemental aid, but if you can be less than new money, then that's very good, and financially that works very well. And then the change in salary and benefits to know what is that percentage and why is it changing. Perhaps it's changing because you had more special ed students that came into your district and you had to hire associates. Or maybe it's a special position you hired and you know and you've planned for it, so that 1 year you can explain the change, and then that's ongoing in your budget. So your first one, again, enrollment is so important. It's a major driver in the state aid formula. It's your resident students times that district cost per pupil. And you can see here, for your 500 to 999 being enrollment, there are 116 school districts. or 35%. That's where you compare in that range. The median is 677, minimum 102. You're very stable, I'd say, pretty consistent. FY20 had a drop, very normal because of COVID. I think most districts saw a similar drop, and a lot of districts saw the same thing in FY21, which is preliminary numbers, but the fact that some students came back, but not all the students came back. So, okay. And then unspent authorized budget ratio. So this is that 5 to 15%. Here you can see your range, 22.4, the 20 to 25%. There are 80 districts that are like you out of 327. Very constant, very stable. You upticked just a little bit in FY21, and most probably because of COVID. You probably maybe weren't able to fill a position, or you might not have been able to fill the sub positions, and so therefore your expenditures decreased.
I was just going to share, Jan, also with that COVID year of 2021, the Current Academy also closed. So that impacted about 70 families in our community. And we were able, as a community, to keep many people, but we did have move-outs because of that as well.
Okay, so that will affect things as well.
One thing I want to add too, you know, Jan talked at the beginning of this that we recommend being between 5 and 15%. That's our recommendation, not to exceed 25%. You know, and you know, I think the statewide median is 22.4%. That was last year. It's actually going to go up a little bit. It's really what the board feels comfortable with. So even though we recommend being between 5 and 15%, there might be a reason or a rationale that, you know, you want to be higher than that. And really what we look for is stability across time as well. So the fact that you're at 20%, yeah, that's what we recommend. But really, I mean, it's stable across time, and that's a good thing. So again, it's really kind of what you feel comfortable with on where you want to be at. The one thing we don't like to see is something that's way above 25%, because that's something that the legislature takes a look at. They would look at that and say, we're providing you funding through the school aid formula and you're not spending it. So that's why we don't want it to get too high. But again, you know, there could be a reason you want it at a higher rate. You actually have some higher open enrollment in than you do open enrollment out. So that's a good thing that you have, but that could change relatively quickly if something would happen within the district. So that might be a reason why you might want to have a higher percentage as an overall goal.
So your annual unspent, again, this one should hover around 0% if you have your unspent ratio where you want it to be. And again, just as Sean mentioned, that's something that, you know, local boards, you decide where you want that to be and adjust otherwise. But when you look at this and you can see it's fairly constant. FY21 again makes sense. You see the uptick. We saw that following through from the previous slide. So. Solvency ratio, which is your cash, again, at the end of the year, your percent of revenue that's remaining. Remind me that FY20 max, 118.4%.
Yeah, I don't remember which
Remember?
district that is. No.
Okay, all right. Then you have a median 19.3 and then a negative minimum. Very consistent, very stable across the years from 16 to 21. Looks really good. And again, that financial solvency is important so that you can cover those 3 months when you're not getting any of the revenues in. General fund expenditures versus revenue, and here your story is still the same. You're very stable, very consistent, which is really good. In FY21, it follows the same logic. You dip down a little bit, so your expenditures weren't as much as your revenue. And then salary and benefit. So this is where we talked about being 75 to 82% of your general fund expenditures. And here, again, you're very constant, a little drop in FY21. And as it mentions, COVID could affect that. I don't know, I got to think that you're the same as every other district with not being able to get subs filled and those kind of positions.
Yeah, I actually took a look at this morning, and when you adjust for the COVID funding, you're actually at 77.4%. So really the COVID issue kind of dropped you down a couple percentage points. So you've been very stable across time.
And that's extrapolating the federal dollars.
Right.
That's
Yep.
what, in that percentage. So your softer key measures, new money versus settlement versus your change in salary and benefits. New money, again, is your state supplemental aid plus your change in enrollment, and then your settlements. And you can see down below, FY16, FY17 was a very good year. Your new money was over 7%, negotiations was 3.53%. The last 2 years also were good as far as your new money was more than what your negotiated settlement was. And then your change in salary and benefit percentage, you just need to know what your story is, and that helps you when you're looking at your budget and forecasting forward.
So we're going to shift gears again a little bit, talk about some more financial information. We touched on the enrollments. So Jan mentioned the certified enrollments, and that's your resident student count. That's represented by the orange bars. That's sometimes referred to as the budget enrollment, and that generates the funding through the school aid formula. So it's important to know the difference between the certified enrollment and the served enrollment, which is the green bar. Those are the number of kids sitting in your school district. So that basically factors in any open enrollment out students, and then also factors in any open enrollment in students. So when your served enrollment's greater than your certified enrollment, that means you have more students open enrolling in than you have open enrolling out. And that's a good thing, because the district where those students reside actually cuts your school district a check for those students. So it's generating some additional revenue for your school district. The thing that we look at here again is kind of what we'd like to see is enrollments going up. For your district, both the certified enrollment and the served enrollment has been relatively flat over time, kind of bouncing around a little bit, and it did take a dip the last 2 years, more than likely COVID related. But this last fall it did come up a little bit, so that's definitely a good thing. But the one thing I'd like to point out is, districts that have had, declining enrollments or flat enrollments over time, Jan talked about the low supplemental state aid rates. When I first started working for the legislature 20 some years ago, you could bank on 4% supplemental state aid every year. We haven't had 4% since 2014, I think, 8 years ago. The governor's recommending 2.5%, and I will say that that's not a good sign. One, because inflation's so high, and two, because the legislature usually has a history of coming in below what the governor's recommending. So I haven't seen a bill from the legislature yet, but you have to remember it's the legislature that decides what this rate is going to be, and I'm not really optimistic it's going to be more than 2.5%, which that's going to put a strain on every school district because inflation is 7%. I think Jan talked about transportation costs for a couple of metro districts going up by 9%. 2.5% is not going to cover that cost. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's disappointing from the legislature. But anyway, enrollment's kind of the main factor because that's, especially the certified enrollment, because that's driving school districts' budgets and impacts the school aid formula. So then we talked about your open enrollment in and open enrollment out situation. So the chart on the top represents your open enrollment out, and for this last fall you had 58 students that open enrolled out, which was pretty close to what you had last year. And this fall you had 120 students that open enrolled in. So the bottom chart then shows what that net revenue impact is. So for students that open enrolled out, you're cutting that school district a check and you're receiving a check from the open enrolled in students. So your net gain on that is about $440,000. That's a good thing, roughly that could be about 8 teachers potentially. So definitely a good revenue source. But again, you kind of have to know why these students are open enrolling into your district. And because you don't want to lose this revenue. You want to make sure that you continually bring in those students, because if something bad would happen, or if something, you change your instruction and maybe that they're coming here for a certain reason and that changes, that could be a revenue loss immediately. Here's a breakdown of general fund revenues and expenditures. So the top chart is your fiscal year 21 general fund revenues. And for most school districts in the state, the blue section is going to be the largest portion. Roughly, this is 53% comes from state sources. 26% is the second portion, that comes from local property taxes. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is for federal dollars, your school district receives 6%. And that's really up from prior years. And again, it's the ESSER dollars that school districts have been receiving. So I think last year in fiscal year 20, that percentage was 4%. I anticipate this will, for fiscal year 22, the year that we're currently in, that percentage will probably go up again, just because we're receiving so much federal aid. But I also like to point out that the federal aid dollars are good, but they're one-time in nature. They are not going to, that money is not going to keep flowing to the school districts, and you have to keep that in mind. You probably don't want to be paying salaries and benefits out of your ESSER dollars just because it's one time in nature. Those are going to be going away. On the bottom side there, that just represents the expenditures, salaries and benefits we talked about already, represents about 77% of the school district's expenditures. The other portion that's relatively large are the purchase services, which represent about 13%. And this picture, again, COVID kind of has an impact on that as well, the COVID funding, because you probably had more in purchase services than you had, or in supplies than you've had in the past. So again, kind of anticipate that graphic changing in a couple of years back to what we've normally seen in the past. So this is just some information. We have a tool on our website. It's called a New Money Calculator, and I know it's a lot of numbers on here. But what this does is it shows you the funding generated for your regular program. And the regular program dollars represent about 70% of what's generated through the school aid formula. And really, all it does is it take a look at your certified enrollment, the supplemental state aid rate, which I put in the 2.5%, and then it goes through and calculates how much funding you're going to get and whether or not you're going to be eligible for budget guarantee. And we'll talk about budget guarantee in a couple slides here. Well, what this does is for fiscal year 23, it takes your enrollment of 968, it takes that 2.5%, which equates to a $181 increase in your per pupil amount. So your new per pupil amount will be $7,408 for fiscal year 23. When we take a look at that, basically that's going to generate the school district about $7.1 million in regular program dollars. This next cell here shows whether or not you're going to be eligible for budget guarantee, and you are not this year. And then it goes through the calculation of what your new money amount is, which takes your total regular program dollars from the fiscal year 23 and compares it to the prior year. So your new money amount for fiscal year 23 based on that enrollment figure is $113,000. That's going to be your increase in your budget, which represents 1.6%. So even though supplemental state aid's 2.5%, you're only going to have new money of about 1.6%. And the reason that is because last year you were on budget guarantee. And the budget guarantee kind of provides a buffer, somewhat of a buffer for districts that lose enrollments that aren't outweighed by whatever supplemental state aid is. So last year we had the COVID year, you had a big decrease in enrollments. Supplemental state aid was 2.4%. So you hadn't been eligible for budget guarantee for quite a while, but last year, the current year we're in, you were for $234,000. So what this projector does is it basically goes out for 5 years, and based on the supplemental state aid amounts we're estimating here, it shows you what your new money amounts are for the out years. But I did want to talk about budget guarantee. So what is budget guarantee? Like I said, it kind of provides a buffer for school districts that have a loss in enrollments. It's not truly a solution, it just kind of softens the blow from that enrollment decrease. So it gives you 101% of the prior year's regular program cost, not including any prior year's budget guarantee if you receive that. And again, it requires board approval because it's funded with local property taxes. And even though it's local property taxes, we always urge boards to approve this because you always want to make sure you capture as much spending authority and revenue as you can for your regular program. So this is general fund dollars. So it's always important to make sure if you're eligible for a budget guarantee to make sure you approve that. So this is just an example, and unfortunately you're not in this shape, but there are a lot of school districts in Iowa that are in this shape. So this just shows that we have a district losing enrollments, 10 students each year over a 5-year period of time. And then we kind of go through, you set supplemental state aid at 1% at year 3 through 5, and then it goes through the calculation. So in year one, they weren't eligible for budget guarantee, but in year two, they were. They received a small amount of budget guarantee for $18,000. In that year one, that guarantees them a 1% increase in new money. So you can see down here, the red represents that budget guarantee amount, and the blue and the red together represent that total budget amount. So the thing I like to point out is they're losing enrollment each year, supplemental state aid's been very poor, and what happens to their overall budget amount? It's going down. So even though they're eligible for budget guarantee each year, it does soften the blow of the overall impact, because if they didn't have it, they'd be at just the blue area. But you can see over that 4-year period of time, this district has actually lost $25,000, a true reduction in their overall budget. So, like I said, your district's not in that shape. You've been relatively stable on your enrollments. You've been eligible for budget guarantee a couple of times, but not consecutive years.
I've talked to John Parker in the past, and he's recommended that districts go ahead and board approve budget guarantee every year.
That's
So
a
you
good
should
point.
need it.
Yes, and the reason that's a good point. You should approve it because a lot of times, especially in past years, the legislature hasn't necessarily set supplemental state aid at the time that you approve your budget, unfortunately. So it's always good just to approve the resolution, whether or not you're eligible for it or not. So when you do that in March, right? Yeah, March or yeah. So good point. Always make sure that you just approve that automatically, then you won't have to worry about it.
It doesn't hurt anything, but if you don't do it, you can't get it.
That's right. So any questions on budget guarantee before I?
Not so much budget guarantee, but I have a question on the page 7 on the solvency. And maybe it's not even 7, maybe it goes back, but does that, so the first paragraph here, out of dollars spent on our students, we were in the state rankings of all districts in the 333 districts, we were 332. Does that indicate less dollars spent on students? Is that what?
Yeah, so it's a factor of what you spent, your general fund expenditures based on your served enrollment. So part of that, for districts that have, like we talked about, you have a higher served enrollment, because of that, that's going to make, generally districts that have a high open enrollment they're going to be they're going to show that they're not going to be as highly ranked as other school districts. So that's one of the reasons. And yes, the amount you spend on a fiscal year basis has an impact on what that ranking is going to be. And that is, the rankings on that are in the book. We don't have them in our slides, but they're near the back. I think they start on page 39. So if you want to take a look at that, you can kind of see the expenditures per pupil. And then we do have some comparisons based on your enrollment size as well. Okay, so we have another slide that shows the students per certified staff. So certified staff would include regular teachers, special ed teachers, early childhood specialists, teacher librarians, nurses, and counselors, I believe. So the chart over here on the left-hand side just shows historically where the district has been. And then the chart on the right-hand side, so it shows fiscal year 21, so last school year. The blue bar there shows what the statewide median is, and it's roughly at about 12. So 12 students per certified staff. You're at 12.4. So you're really close to the median on that. And then I believe this comparison is based on served enrollment size. So similar size school districts across the state. You can kind of see, really you're kind of right in the middle. You have some that are higher, some that are lower, but overall you're kind of right on par with all the districts that are the similar size. And yeah, kind of another factor behind this is, you had a big decrease in enrollment, so that could have impacted that last year as well.
So your tax rate. So this gives you information from 16 through 22, and you've stayed pretty stable. I think the variation is about $1.50. If you look at it, you can see what has increased the tax rate a little bit would be your changes in cash reserve, which made it work, because remember when we saw financial solvency, you were very stable, so you were doing what was needed there. And the other piece was in the management fund, seeing a couple of increases in 21 and 22. When you look at the components of the general fund, the first one is the CDC, combined district cost. So that one, the board has no decision in there. It's just what does it take to make up those dollars from the state aid formula. So you have the state aid dollars, the uniform levy, which the district pays in property tax, plus that additional levy. And then you have the instructional support levy, which the board would have approved in prior years. Cash reserve we talked about, and then your total general fund. Your management, you probably increased because maybe insurance costs were increasing or you were offering early retirement. That's one of those things. The board makes that decision, looks at that balance, and determines what your levy needs to be on an annual basis. You have no PERL. Some districts have it. That's that public equipment recreation levy. Regular PEPL, every district has it. So again, no decision by the board there. That's 33-cent levy. Voter PEPL, though, this one is unique to your district. You don't have that levy. It would be nice if your district had it, because then it operates pretty much like sales tax does. You can use it for infrastructure. You can use it for your equipment needs, your non-instructional software. And that can be up to $1.34. Depends on what a district approves. And then debt, you have no debt. So that factor also leads to the fact that you have a pretty low tax rate in Corinda. And then you can just see, what it's looked like over the years. Pretty consistent. You can see the max being 1998, minimum 787, median's 1309, which you're not too far off of that.
Jan, one of the things that was a challenge to help articulate was, again, with that combined district cost, that's not a decision, there's no decision that
Right.
we can make, we can't do anything about
Right.
that. Is there anything else you can say about that? I think it was indicated that we as a board and conversation were making decisions on that, and that's not.
Yeah, and for the most part, that's just your certified enrollment times that district cost per pupil. And there's some other things too, but that's the bulk of it. So you have the state aid, and that's the amount that's coming from the state, and then every district has the $5.40 levy, no matter what, and then you have to make up the difference with property tax dollars. There's no decision that you get to make, you just have to do it.
Thank you, because that was the property tax question was the big question that people weren't understanding, that our decision didn't impact that property.
No, so, going back to here, there's only a few decisions. That's the cash reserve, the management, and the other decisions pretty much are prior to that, whether it's your instructional support levy or your debt levy.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add too, you keep in mind too that you levy property taxes on behalf of the AEA. So AEAs can't levy property taxes, so all the school districts in the state, part of your property tax in that combined district cost levy includes a property tax for the area education agency. Again, it's required by law, it's mandated, school districts don't have any control over that. So that's a good point. You look at your $12.13 rate, $9.50 of that is basically out of the board's control.
And then you'll see a little difference with the C&I coming off with, so that commercial industrial tax piece is being shifted back because they're not going to fund that anymore. So there's pieces of the uniform levy as well as the additional levy that are going to get shifted back to the local property tax, and you guys have no control over that either. So
Do you have any verbiage on that, Laura? Is there, so that as we,
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Sean has a great
Yeah,
slide too.
we have something on our website, I'll send it to you.
Thank you so much.
So a little bit more on property taxes. Jan talked about your tax rate is really pretty low compared to districts across the state. You're below the median. Here's a comparison group of school districts within your AEA. You're right in the middle. And I would say you're probably on the lower side of the overall tax rates within the school districts within this area education agency. The blue bar then represents what that statewide median is. So again, you're well below the statewide median. And then the different colors, that just represents the different levies. We talked about all the different things that make up the school district levy. That's what that represents, is all those different levies within the school district levy. So I like this chart because I think, when we talk about enrollments, that really doesn't have an impact, or it's not necessarily a good comparison for property tax rate. it's really the net taxable valuations per pupil, and really that's because of the way our school aid formula is built. So I put this comparison up here. This, again, within your area education agency, this shows your net taxable valuations per pupil comparison. So the top chart is, the blue line represents what the statewide average is. You can see you're below that. And the red line shows what the statewide median is, and that's net taxable valuations per pupil. So the higher that your net taxable valuation per pupil is, in general, the lower your overall property tax rate is going to be. Again, that's just kind of the way the school aid formula works. And then on the other side, the lower your net taxable valuation per pupil is, more than likely the higher that your property tax rate is going to be. So this is really, I think, your cohort comparison group is on this net taxable valuations. And when you take a look at that, you're actually really low. I think you might be second or third lowest of all the school districts on this list. So again, there are some discretionary levies that go into this, but in general, this is a good comparison. And when we take a look at this, you're definitely on the low side. So that's a good thing if you're living in the Clarinda school district. So another thing that you can leverage that kind of helps reduce property taxes is you can use an income surtax in order to offset local property taxes. And you have the option of using it for two programs. One of them is instructional support, which you do have, and the other one is a voter-approved Pebble, which you do not have. So you actually use an income surtax rate of 8% for fiscal year 22. That generated about $430,000. Your instructional support property tax rate was 24 cents, but by using that income surtax rate of 8%, you actually were able to lower your property tax rate by $1.20. So that the fact that you use an income surtax, yes, it's still a tax, but it does reduce the overall property tax burden for the people within your school district. So that's good information. Again, you're helping offset your property tax rate by almost $1.28 actually. And then if you did want to pursue a voter-approved Pebble, that would be something, again, the voters have to approve it. It's a 50% plus one, but that's another one where in order to kind of reduce the property tax burden, you could use an income surtax, and obviously the voters would have to approve that, but that could be part of your resolution that you put in front of the voters. So that's something else to keep in mind if you are going to look at a voter-approved Pebble. So I think this is one of the last slides we have. I do want to talk about the shared operational functions. So your district has been using that, and then for the current school fiscal year that we're in, it would have been last school year, you actually shared a counselor, a social worker, and a school business official. So the weighting for that generated 11. So that's like equivalent to 11 students. So you take the cost per pupil times that 11, that generated about $80,000 for your school district in the current fiscal year. For the legislature made a change, kind of a good thing, but also a bad thing. So this last legislative session, they added 3 positions that could be shared. We have a mental health professional, a special ed director, and a work-based learning coordinator. The bad thing is they added this at the very end of the legislative session, so districts didn't really get an opportunity to take advantage of this. And another bad thing is they reduced the weighting by 1 for each one of the positions except for the superintendent position. So I think this year you're sharing an SBO and a social worker. So you actually lose, you would have got 5 last year, now you're only getting 4 and 2. So you're going to see a reduction down to 6 on that. So you're going to lose about $35,000 next fiscal year because of the sharing. Another thing to keep in mind on this is actually set to expire at the end of fiscal year 25. So this is where we kind of need your advocacy. If your district's taking advantage of this, talk to your legislators about extending this. And I think Cecil Dolacek is your representative. He's a strong supporter of the shared operational functions. Unfortunately, he's retiring after this session. I really like him, so he'll be missed. But yes, I would make sure you talk to him about the importance of this, the benefit to the district to make sure this gets extended. What was it, 3 years ago when this, the legislature extended it, but that was a tough hill to climb because I thought it was going to be a slam dunk, but it was really difficult to get that extended. what gives me hope is they keep adding positions to this. So, I mean, the fact is, you know, if they think that this is a worthwhile cause, you know, and they're adding positions, maybe they will be willing to extend it. So, again, it's important to get your advocacy behind this to make sure we can get this provision extended.
May I add something? Also, so at the coffee with some of the legislators, Amy Sinclair really talked about this, and he said, you know, people need to hear from you on that extension. You know, a lot of the things she talked about was not talking about that too much. She doesn't want it to get things to get taken away. But if you look at what we have looked at as a district, so if you think about where our early literacy rates are and the goals that we have set for those, curriculum director, counselor, special ed director, those we're in conversation with other districts around us to see what that looks like. Work-based learning as well, if we should get more onto Iowa Western, as well as any of our other CTE things. Those are sharing conversations with, basically put a dot on the map and draw out about, with your compass, about 15, 20 minutes to 30. And those superintendents have been meeting here in Clarinda to just talk about how we can get more of those dollars captured.
Yeah, and I think, I can't remember, there's a district near Des Moines area that shares a transportation director with the city.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be with another district. It could be, you can all be creative, you know, if it's a community college or an AEA or the city. If there's a chance to be able to share that, definitely pursue it, because it saves you money and it also generates additional funding. So you get the double bonus on it. So definitely a good thing for especially more rural school districts that might, you know, be flat on enrollment or losing enrollment. It's definitely a good thing for school districts. No, I think this is the last thing we had, is the categorical fund balances, just for you to kind of be aware of it. You know, your categorical fund balances, when I look at them, you know, they don't really concern me, but you do want to keep an eye on them on an annual basis. The one thing I did note is your categorical fund balance for the 4-year-old preschool did go up. It had been zero before. It's now, last year was at $79,000. Gifted and talented programs been relatively flat. That's a good thing. We've seen a lot of school districts going up in big leaps and bounds on this, but you've been relatively stable on that. And then the teacher leadership money, it came down a little bit last year. So just kind of keep an eye on that. One thing to note on this is you can actually use your categorical fund balances from 4-year-old preschool, professional development, which looks like you have 25,000, and then teacher leadership. Those can be transferred into a flex account. And then once you transfer them into a flex account, the board designates how those funds could be used. And then one of the things could be for any general fund purpose. So, you know, make sure, especially the teacher leadership money, that might be something that you might want to take a look at. Those would be funds that could go into the flex account.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Nancy and I. We've been talking about that. I was looking at our balances, and, you know, teacher leadership has usually been so in a box a little bit. So with the flexibility, when I looked at that number, there's a lot we could do when we think about, we're getting ready to write our grant together again with our teacher leaders. And we really need to look at some of the Future Ready Iowa STEM initiatives that are becoming requirements, and that could be a place to, in that teacher leadership, to have someone that's that point person to move our work forward should we decide to do that. The other thing with preschool is probably because of our closing with the community preschool closing, and then like at the very end, right in the spring, we had to scramble and we went from a full classroom to 2 half days. So that probably explains the dollars there.
Yeah, the one thing I'd note too is you need to remember that any balances are one-time in nature. So even though you might have a large balance,
Right.
you really shouldn't be using it for ongoing expenses.
Right.
So always kind of keep that in mind as well.
One thing to add,
Yeah.
this is the first time this year on the certified annual report, which school business officials do every year, that the Department of Ed looked at those balances and asked questions. You know, so if it's a larger balance, they're asking you, what are you going to be doing with that money? So they are looking at those balances and expecting them to be used.
Those are those dollars to kids.
So just to kind of wrap up our portion, talked about all the key data points, and really the unspent authorized budget, that's the most important, because that's, if you go negative in that, which your district's not, the district has violated the law again, but your district is not doing that. Your historic trend information looks good. Laura's going to talk about projections in the future. Certified enrollments, what's driving the budget? It's been down from a couple of years ago. What's going to be the impact in the future? Do you anticipate enrollments going up, or are they going to, stay flat over time? But that has an important impact on your overall budget. And again, served enrollments generate funding, but they've been down for the past couple of years, more than likely COVID related. And then, is there potential to add voter approved Pebble? This can generate some additional revenue for infrastructure purposes. Your tax rate is pretty low overall. This might be something that you might want to take a look at in the future.
Thank you. We talked about that, I think the first year that I was here, and then with COVID and transition with our SBOs, that's something we didn't get to. So those of you that have been here that whole time, that had been our goal. So that's a great conversation for the larger board now.
And that's all we had, so unless you have questions for us, I'm going to turn it over to Laura. All right.
Thanks.
Afternoon, I'm gonna apologize. I woke up like this morning. I didn't even have a good time last night, so I don't even know what's wrong with me today. So I'm gonna, hopefully it won't be too obnoxious as we go through this. I'm Laura Appenzell, I'm with Forecast 5, so I work closely with Nancy and Chris and Shirley on the finances. I'm a former SBO myself. I was CFO for several years for a district in the metro. Prior to that, I was a teacher. And so I've lived both sides and was in the corporate sector. I'm back in the corporate sector doing this. So I had the opportunity to go to work for Forecast 5. I used this myself when I was the CFO and projecting our finances. And so we're going to look today kind of where you have been, where you are, talk about the assumptions that we've put in, and then about what do you guys want to consider as you look forward. Okay, so again, we talked about enrollment. It's a big deal. So when you look here, the biggest thing is, like we've said before, you've been kind of all over the map, right? Down 21, up 18, down 47, and then we recouped about half of that. Got about 24 back. The question really isn't driving forward. We left it at 0 when we looked at the projections, just as a stable place to start, right? Some people go out and they look to see what their housing development looks like. Do they have anything new coming in? Is there potentially a larger preschool that might drive some of that? But that's one of those things to get a handle around, if you can, on what you think your enrollment's going to be. So when you look at the general fund, so this is from the board read report. So if those of you that have been here have maybe seen that before, there are graphs and then there are the Excel pieces of it. So from a picture piece of it, you can kind of see where you've been the last 5 years. So you go back, the first one, surplus deficit, that's on an annual basis. So the money came in, the money that went out, where were you at the end of the year? So you can see mostly you've been in the black. Now, 22, that really big number is due to ESSER. And we're gonna get to that a little bit later, but right now you've got ESSER money that you haven't planned for. So you have a huge amount of revenue, but we have to figure out what those expenses are going to be. So that's why that number is so large for 22. And that's why your fund balance looks like it jumps. Okay, but it really is not going to, but we have to have it in there because right now you've got the revenue piece, we just have to figure out our expense side. And that's when you look back, red versus blue, they're pretty even for the most part as you go through historically. Down a little bit in 21, and we'll blame COVID for everything at the moment, but that's where that happened. And now in 22 is deciding how we're going to deal with these ESSER one-time funds that we have. So here are the numbers piece again. Breaking out the major categories, so local, your property taxes, state funds, and federal. So you can see as you go across there, typically you guys are like 600-ish, maybe up to a little bit 700, but these have a big uptick of 2.2 million of federal money. Again, that one-time money that's not going to keep coming back around, so we see a big jump in the federal. Down below, your major expenditure categories, salaries, benefits, purchase services, supplies, property, and then miscellaneous. The nice thing about this is to go back and look and say, okay, from one year to the next, Are we consistent, or is there something that happened in that year? Did we hire 3 teachers? Did we reduce something? So you understand where things have been, so you can kind of figure out where to go in the future, okay? And then at the bottom, that piece down there, fund balance is a month of expenditures. That's like if you were to close the books today, how much money do you have in the bank to pay out the bills you might still have? Sometimes you'll need to talk about that too when you go into like a bonding situation. Your creditors want to know how stable you are fiscally. Just another measure of that. So now we're going to look ahead. Okay, so if you think about it, remember that 1.9 million-ish in 2022 is not really where we're going to end. You're not really going to go down negative 1.5, right? But we got to figure out where the expenses are to balance that out, and then to look forward about where are we going to be. Now, right now we're showing a downward trend in fund balance. Some of that, we have to work out this ESSER piece to figure out the stability piece of, are you going to put people on it or not? Because if you do, that one-time revenue piece, you're going to have to take those expenses and then put them back to a general fund line when your revenue runs out. So that will have an impact in that ongoing fund balance. So that's why on this one here, the miscellaneous revenue, this is a really weird term in school finance, miscellaneous revenue. But all of these things, which I don't expect you to see up here, but you've got it in your handout, these all add into miscellaneous revenue. And the ones in yellow down there, you see that I highlighted, those are your ESSER funds. So you got 4043, that's your 20% learning loss that you have to use. 4045 is ESSER 3, that's where you see the million piece. And then you got a little bit left in 4051 and in 4055. You have to get all that spent in a certain amount of time. And right now, I think it's the end of 24. I think it's like technically November. It really pushes into FY25. But most people are trying to get it done and taken care of, so it's not like this looming cloud that we still have to figure out what to do with. That's why you see in the out years, we took it out. So right now in your model, it shows all the revenue in this current year so that you're not overstating potentially your revenues in the future. Okay? And if at any point, stop if you got a question. So how are we coming up with these numbers? So assumption-wise, when I worked with Nancy and Chris, we went through stable enrollment. We put the 2.5 in since we got that from the governor, and we kept it at 2% for supplemental state aid in the future. We also, you can see your cash reserve levy of 415 is what it is this year. But by the CAR, you can only levy 181 next year. That's the max because there's a formula. 20% of your expenditures is what you're allowed to expend. And you can see in the future, we have 0 in there for cash because it's a function of that percentage. You get to a point that won't allow you to put cash on. So we have the 181 in and then took it out. And then your valuation, we believe it's about 2.97. The counties are still finalizing everything at the moment. So as soon as they do that and the department manager releases it, then we will update that. But it just makes an impact on your overall tax rate. And then the rest of it goes kind of towards the SBRC piece. So you've got your SBRC modified. That's like for open enrollment, not on head count. If you had kiddos coming in, LEP, those kind of things where you can ask for the authority and you don't get the money necessarily in that year, but it comes to you. And then your special ed deficit. So we've got 175,000 in there right now. We can bump that up as we go, but that's where we've started with that piece of it. Then the rest of the assumptions, that's what this one's trying to show you. We did no staff changes, no enrollment changes. We talked about keeping the tax rate the same, and in doing that, you could actually put the PEPL on and not have your tax rate change. So that's the beauty of having some flexibility within the levies, that because of where you are, you could add that. Again, we talked about ESSER. We accounted for it in 22, completely spent it in 23, and then gone for those future years out. So that's why you see a big uptick in expenditures in 23, because we wanted to back that out, again, to not overstate expenses in the future. So essentially, they wash each other between 22 and 23. And then the salary increase is at 3%. This gets back to what Sean and Jan were talking about, inflation, and with the new change in the legislature of where they can go. So right now, if your negotiations didn't go well and you want to go to arbitration, 3% would be the minimum. So we put that in as a starting point. Not saying you can or can't afford that, but because of law change, that's how that new formula works. Okay, so there you can see too the rest of the assumptions. No changes in staff. We have the 33 in there of PEPL, And then we have some management money factored in. The beauty of it is you're at the point, like we're setting the groundwork for you to have the discussions of where you want to go. And the nice thing is that Nancy can come in and run these reports and say, okay, the board wants me to look at X. We go in and we change the assumptions, see how does that play out from a fund balance, a tax rate, and where we're gonna be in the future. So that's a nice thing about the tool is it's pretty easy. And even if you were in a work session like this, she could pull it up and go live. And I know I'm putting her on the spot, but I would be in her back pocket to help her. But it's a nice tool because you can make very quick changes and see how that plays out. So right now you can see your fund balance starts to come down a little bit. Your tax rate 12.13. So we went in and set it at 12.13 for next year. And basically looking at management fund, but that's where you can see, because you got nothing down here, right? You've got no debt service, you got no wood and pebble. So you could take some of this too and put it down here and not change your tax rate. Or potentially even come down a little bit depending on how you wanted to do it. And that's why you see this is so low out here. We didn't do anything going forward. We didn't make any other changes. We didn't put your cash reserve or anything like that in. So you have the ability now to really kind of work with it and decide where you want to go. We talked a little bit about the C&I, and Sean does have a really great slide to share, but this is, come 23, the commercial industrial replacement is gone. So what that means is on the first piece of your uniform levy, it's the government literally is going to shift from right hand to left hand, right? It's going to go from C&I over to supplemental state aid. That's where that piece is going to come in. So they can, this is me being biased, they can pretend to give us more money. They just shifted it from one side to the other, but they'll factor it in that way. On your additional levy though, now it becomes a property tax increase because that's back to local property tax to pick up that piece that was C&I. It now doesn't have a right to left hand to go. Your property tax is going to have to come up. And then every other piece of the levy, management, and you don't have debt, or PEPL, those C&I pieces are actually lost revenue and are gone. So the only way to recoup that piece is through increased property tax. So that's one of those things when they put it in place 10 years ago and we tried to tell them it was a bad idea, it finally played out and we were right. But
Laura, I have a quick question. So for rural communities our size, we have quite a bigger commercial industrial base. So would that be a bigger amount of money than a lot of?
It really depends on the valuation piece of it. So I don't know if you know their numbers off the top, but that's where it comes in. And that's why even when I was at the district, we were real cautious because we had debt service. I banked it because I knew that they were going to take it away. So, and that's what they did. But that's where now you have the ability to kind of look out and figure out what kind of shift potentially that might be. Now, hopefully your property valuations go up some to offset that too. So if your valuation goes up, you can offset a little bit of that property tax spread out piece of it.
I have a question about the enrollment figures. When I read this thing, I went back into the Department of Education and enrolled the projectors, and it goes, I think, to 2030. They're showing about a 250 drop in enrollment up until that time. Was that figured in this at all?
No, we didn't change anything. So that's something the board has to decide whose numbers they believe. We do have a scenario set up. And I say that because
Like
sometimes their numbers are a little bit off.
Yeah, so I used to work at the Department of Ed, and that's an area that we worked on. And just so you know, on a statewide level, the numbers that they put together are usually pretty good. But when it comes to the district by district ones, you have to be really careful when you're looking at them. And I will say too, I'm not sure what the date was on the ones that you looked at it, but they do update them annually.
Whatever was up there today.
Okay, because I'm not sure that's up to date. So I know that they released some new ones in September. I don't think they posted those on their website, so those would probably be, and I have those and I can send them to you. You can take a look at them because I don't think they'll be quite as drastic as the ones that are up.
Now, the scenario we have, I do have one that has Sean's numbers so that Nancy could go in and that would just be the one difference between what you're seeing now and that. So it would match up to the numbers that Sean has. But that would be to the point of you look at those and then do you want to have a third scenario, like it's the worst case, right, that we're going to drop down and what would that potentially do? But right, that's where you have to kind of know
Looking at
your people.
projecting budgets, probably the important figures are the next 2 or 3 years.
Yes,
Yes.
right.
That's what I think we need to focus in on.
Exactly.
2030 will probably be foaming dead. It'll be a larger school district. So.
Well, and one of the things we're talking about is just that, Paul. How do we make ourselves attractive for that open enrollment piece? So for example, I was talking with our principals about that online option that some local areas have. When you look at students, who do we lose? We've been asking that question. So Nancy and I were talking about kids that participate in rodeo, kids that are homeschool. We have upticked our homeschool kids to more dual enrollment because that generates revenue for us. So we've been reaching out and doing more with those. So we just have to, those are things for us to think about, knowing that right now it looks potentially flat.
And that was a great point, because even when I was working with my board, we focused really hard on the next year out and the second year, because I was like, if I had a crystal ball and could do the next out through 5, I would have a different job. So, but the real thing to think about is to make these subtle changes in the next 2 years, right? So you don't have to all of a sudden have the oh crap moment when now you're gonna make it big because you just kept kind of kicking the can and hope it would go away. So if you can like look out and just make those subtle changes to keep you in the black, to keep things going, it makes things a lot easier and it's less of an impact to the students in the classroom, right? Because nobody wants to have to go in and have a year where you gotta cut 10 people and figure out where it goes. That's the beauty of looking ahead and making these incremental changes to try to lessen that impact.
And Laura, I'm gonna share one other thing. So just, it's for the board learning if you're new. When I came, we had a year where our largest class was heading to the high school. So we looked at our staffing. We were down 3 teachers to cover their core classes, okay? Sometimes, I know Jan, we talk about what, one FTE for the whole Johnson district. We had to come up with 3 new FTE. So part of what we looked at is not taking that from students or teachers. And we went to our administration and thinned our administration by 1 administrator to cover those 3 teachers, because there was not that 2 and 3 year projection that we're doing right now to look and see how does that relate to staffing, how does that relate to kids and seats and numbers and things like that.
Okay. Then you can see at the bottom of the tax rate piece broken out by the different pieces of the levy to get to your total rate, and then you get your surge tax at the bottom. So again, looking at your UAB, so you can see you have a little bit of a reduction, and that's really due to the ESSER, right? Because we had this revenue, we got to spend it, and it reduces down our annual authority basically. But you can see then it levels back out again, and your solvency, you can see it starts to kind of tick down. Now, granted, out there in 27, it says 0.5. I would tell you, just don't get alarmed, because you're going to make some subtle changes in here, because we're not exactly sure where you'll end in 24. Maybe you can put cash on, because right now those numbers are just simple math. It's just taking plus, minus, and doing the thing forward. So you could put some cash on and bump that solvency up, because remember back on the tax rate, we have no cash reserve levy going in beyond the current year. So again, it's just you get to make some choices up going forward as to how you want that to play out. So visually, if you want to look to see kind of where it goes, you can see your supplemental state aid is the orange line compared to certified enrollment. So you can see back when Sean was talking about, we used to be up a little bit higher, and now we dipped down there in 21, and we're kind of trying to hopefully stabilize out. And then your UAB, really for the most part, pretty consistent. Same thing as you go into now here, you can see things start to that solvency. You know, we showed that it was going down. Well, we weren't putting on cash. We haven't done anything with our tax rate. So those out years, we're just going to kind of not really focus a whole lot, but look to do 23, 24, and where do we want that? Because then we can even out that trend. And then down below is the miscellaneous. There's our 22. There's all our ESSER money. It's popped way up. Then we come back down to what would be normal miscellaneous revenue. So this is I like this from, if you're not really sure of, okay, how does UAB get calculated? On the left-hand side, everything there has either a plus or minus, either adds to or takes away from your UAB to get you down to the bottom. My favorite part is this piece at the bottom. When we talk about expenditure change and looking at annually, so that very bottom line is on an annual basis, how much are you spending of what you're taking in? So if you want your UAB to stabilize or go up a little bit, you have to be under 100%. So you can see back in 17, you were at 95, you went to 98, then we get up to 97 and 20, 97. Now, right now, it says 87 and 22. We still have some expenditures to work on yet for the rest of the year. That's not gonna stay at 87. So that number, we're gonna adjust the budget, it'll come up. And then you can see you go over 100% potentially, that's where you see that negative 800,000, then the negative 1.1 because we spent the ESSER dollars and they're gone. But this just gives you the ability to look out. The gray is obviously the current line. You can see there's your budget guarantee up top up there. But to see, are we gonna be able to stabilize that unspent budget authority? Where's it gonna go? Because this is the one thing where you wanna look to the future, because this one snowballs on you very quickly. If you do a few things, add a few positions, and didn't really double check that bottom line, are you over 100? Pretty soon your UAB will go and get the wrong direction, okay? So just again, graphically, kind of where is that UAB going? Again, you can see that gray is the current year and just where we're spending. So we've been doing some discussions. The nice thing is you guys also have plus. So Nancy's loading your monthly financials every month. So we're monitoring that. We're 6 months basically into the fiscal year, so we feel pretty good about we're halfway through. The nice thing is we can look at that budget we loaded and look at our projected budget. So your projected budget is looking at actuals year to date and then taking into consideration what you did in those previous 5 years at that point in time to do the math. Okay, where do we think you will end up from a projection standpoint? Then I know you guys are in discussions about the ESSER. Once you get that piece figured out, then we will update it and we'll have a much better idea of where you're actually gonna end to see if we're gonna be closer, you know, probably in the 90s really when it comes down to your actual expenditures. Solvency and cash. So on this side, you can see what you actually did for cash reserve levy, and then we drop it down to show what you might be able to in the maximum. As you get out there, you can put on more cash potentially, but that's again, when you're trying to manage that solvency ratio, especially if you're going to do anything big, go out for bond, you're gonna want that number to come back up. Most of the S&P or Moody's, they wanna see at least 15%, and that you have an explanation of how those things are gonna go. So if that's something that you're looking at, we need a major renovation or we need to do a building, this is where you have the ability to look ahead and go, okay, in a couple years we need that number really to bump up a little bit. So what can we do to tweak that and adjust it? That's where the 5-year lookout is really a nice way to help you get in a better position for a bond or something bigger to do. So here's where you're gonna have to start to have those conversations and do a little bit of the work, is where do we want that tax rate to go? They talked about we don't have a lot of control over the general. You really don't. I mean, I know I joked with my board, they got 2 decisions. They get to do their dropout, and what do you wanna do for cash? Basically everything else in the general fund is set for them when it comes through on the aid and levy. There's really very little wiggle room there. So then you come down to management and the other pieces of the levy. So if, especially if you're trying to think about, if you've been spending out of the general fund, potentially, on things that could be shifted to PEPL or SAVE, if you had the ability for more in PEPL, then you free up more general fund dollars for the staff and the students. So that's where you can start to look out and go, okay, if we put that in place, what does that mean for us in the future? And that's where you'll see 2 people might bump up management one year because the next couple of years they want to drop that way down to make it more even as you go forward, okay? So where's all this money going? And Sean had some too. Here's just another look for us from out of FY22. Where is your money coming? So this is a miscellaneous revenue piece of it. You can see this year, normally that gray revenue, federal, very small. For most, it's like usually the smallest piece of the pie. But because of ESSER for the next couple of years, that one way out is just way outdoing itself. That's why you've got just so much in there. And then where's the rest of it going? So salary-wise, from just kind of a graphical perspective, obviously salaries and benefits, you can see 56 in salaries and 19 in benefits. And then from your revenue, bulk of it's coming down there on the state side. And then you see the federal piece, again, it's just a little bit larger than what it normally would. But sometimes it's just nice to see in a little different format to understand really where everything is coming from. I gave you 2 other handouts so you can see them a little bit better. This is coming from your plus model. So this is your data loaded through December. And so the way this works is it takes in the month of December in 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, this is where you were in all those previous 5 years. So you can go, okay, compared to the current year, are we lining up about to how we were doing things in the last year? Or I know I can explain it because we did something different in XYZ year. So you can see your UAB numbers, the UAB ratio, there's the target from ISB, and you can see where your expenditures are. So in 21, you were at 4 million in December, and right now we're at about 4.2. So Really, that's probably pretty normal if you think about it, just increased costs and some expenses. So that seems to be reasonable. Then we drop down to the annual piece of it. So money in, money out in 1 year, how are you doing? Where do you think you're gonna land? And then you can get down to the solvency piece. So you see revenue, and we always are double checking on AE flow through to make sure that people have booked it. Some people book it in 1 month, they do it all at once. Some book it every month to get through the end. My biggest thing is as we get closer to the end of the year that number is there, because we don't want you to not book it, because when you don't get it booked, then it creates a problem. It tells you have revenue you don't have. So we have that line in there for the AA flow through, showing you kind of where to we think your fund balance will land. And that's why, show me that distinction on categorical versus not, because in that $2.3 million of projected fund balance are your categorical funds. Some districts, when they pull the categorical piece out of their fund balance, have very little actually free general fund money to use. So it really is critical to know of that fund balance, how much it really is free general fund money for us to use, or how much of it is locked up in the categorical that I can't really use. Then as we go on down to the bottom, this is the board's big piece of it, because now we get to certified budget. You guys are responsible for certifying the budget where you're gonna go. Remember, very different from the line item budget. So we certify really a 30,000 foot view of the budget in the certified budget. Then we break down later in the year and we do the line by line item budget for the fiscal year. But critical, because what happens down here at the bottom is you don't want red, because that means you go over, and we know if you go over $1 in a certified budget category, you get a little slap on the wrist, you get an audit comment, and nobody really wants to have that. So the nice thing about this is it's telling you, okay, here's what you certified to the state last April. This is the budget we loaded, and is there a variance right now? Okay, because remember, we did certified budget, and then they told us about ESSER 3. So I wouldn't be surprised if most districts in the state of Iowa have to do a budget amendment because we didn't have numbers, we made our budget. So you've got this. Then you flip to their side. So here's my certified budget again, same thing, but here's the projected budget. So based on the actuals that you've loaded year to date, plus your trend, does it appear you're going to meet or exceed that certified budget and need to make an amendment? So this way, every month you can kind of monitor that. You can go back and double check like, oh, okay, why is that so big there? Sometimes people have construction and all of a sudden the bills came in earlier than what they were supposed to, so then they have to make an amendment because they got stuff done quicker. So it's just a way for you to track and not wait till May, because you have to do it by the end of May. If you're gonna amend your budget, it has to be done. And there's timelines, so as far as, you have to get it in the newspaper, you have to have the hearing and do all that, so it's not something you can just quickie do in a board session. But this will give you the ability to kind of keep track of it as you go throughout the year to see, are you on track with your certified budget or not? Any questions over this? So these are your numbers pulled out, we've loaded through December. Okay? And then this is just another way to look at it, and this one I did it, it's front and back because it's too long. So this is more of like a cash flow kind of statement. So you're looking at revenues and expenditures, focusing on the general fund. So you can see in the last 5 years, in December, where were you from revenues versus expenditures? And since this is a nice way, I think, to see if anything's out of whack quickly. Sometimes people, it's a timing issue. Maybe certain revenue didn't come in, or the property taxes didn't get loaded in the right month. You can go back and fix and check. But it just gives you an idea of, are we pretty consistent to where we've been, so that you can feel like things are on the right track. Then the other funds, because it would be 5 months long, we just had the year to date. So our activity fund, management, sales tax. The caveat to that is when you get to the bottom, you see surplus or deficit and revenue, and if it's red, it really just could be a timing issue. So you think about management of when the property taxes come in, you may be actually behind your revenues because when you had to pay out your expense, you get the property tax again in April. So as soon as it comes in, then the fund will be back to normal. That's why we try to do at the bottom there, project where your fund balance will be, because the system knows you've got another set of property taxes coming in. Okay. So here we go back. Oh, did I go the wrong way? Oh, no, you didn't. Okay. So again, it's just a nice way for you to be able to look at in it. So you really have two things going, right? We're looking at the projection for 5 years, And then we're keeping a closer eagle eye on the line item budget to see if there's any variances that we might need to go in and check. And then that's something we're doing, we're working, so Shannon and I have a partner who Shannon helps a lot with the plus side of things. So between the two of us, we try to help out as much as we can on the finance side. So the idea was to give you an idea of where are you right now, and what are the things that you need to start to look at as you get ready to do certified budget and start to look ahead of what are those places where we might need to make some adjustments, what do we want to do, and look ahead. Because it's not, you can't just do the PEPAL, right? Like if you want to do it, you need to get a hold of the attorney, there's timelines, and you need to start the whole campaign of how you're going to go about and do that. But the idea from here was to give you a sense of where you were, and now to start to go to look at, okay, from an FTE standpoint, how's that going to affect the bottom line? If we do 3%, what does that do? And then what's our ESSER plan look like? Because that right now, that's kind of the big looming thing for you guys is the ESSER piece. Where are we going to put those expenses, and how's that going to impact the bottom line? Any questions for me?
And one question about the ESSER funds.
Mm-hmm.
If they're used to purchase property that goes on, like in Title I, we had age them over a certain period of time, some of those type of things. Does that affect the district bottom line, or is that in a whole separate category, purchased? Whatever you classify as purchased property.
So with the ESSER funds, like you could do an HVAC system, right? So it's a one-time purchase, and we don't really depreciate.
What? I thought you were limited as to how much you could charge off in 1 year.
Well, in the public sector, we don't really do depreciation. It's not really like in the private sector because we have no tax base that we're trying to reduce, like our tax bill. So for us, we just purchase the item.
You do depreciate because I think that was one of the arguments I've heard about why school districts have to charge rent is because the buildings and the property depreciate. And that, I think on your when they do the audit, because most districts and buildings get to about 20 years, they start looking at another bond issues because one, their debt's probably gone, and two, the property doesn't have any value.
Well, it's more from a factor of the building itself. From an infrastructure, it doesn't need to be updated because at the end of the day, there are statements in there as far as to gap and how buildings are, but technically the public school district can't depreciate anything because there's no way for us, there's no tax bill to take it off of. So our buildings have value over time, but your bond is a 20-year bond. When it's paid off, it's paid off. So then you just have to, it's more about as you go through those years, what's the maintenance schedule look like on that and how are you paying for that? Is it coming out of save if you have PEPAL? Because if it's not, your only other option is a general fund.
Yeah. I guess what raised that question is I used to do 2 reporting on Title I and all these career technical programs. If an item you purchased was over a certain amount, you couldn't charge that whole thing off in 1 year. You had to age it. So if you bought a drill press and it was over that amount, you take it off. So if you had it for a year and you had to get rid of it, then that amount is still shown on your books because it's there. And when you report it to Title I, you have to show it's there. There's a procedure you have to dispose of it. Is that still applicable anymore?
Not since I came into K-12. The only depreciation that exists in K-12 is in the enterprise fund.
Yeah.
Maybe
And
I'm using the wrong.
your nutrition fund and
Using
your
the
community
wrong
ed.
terminology, but I know when I did those, you could only charge off a certain amount.
Well, and it may be a factor of the rule of what you can buy and how much of it can be charged to Title I, because there are very specific rules on what those funds can be used for and how much can be spent on that kind of stuff with those types of funds.
Well, I think with Perkins 5 and your regional planning dollars, that looks a little different now.
Yeah.
Those rules have been rewritten.
But you still have to tag it, right?
Yeah, everything, you still have to,
Absolutely.
well, depending on what your board policy is, whatever you set the dollar threshold at that point, right, then you have to tag things. But you have the ability to set that number where you want it.
That's what I thought.
And on ESSER that you mentioned earlier, anything 5,000 above, you have to get the DE approval
Okay.
before you can proceed.
I did not know that.
Yep.
I don't read that, sir.
Well, we didn't really want to read it either.
Yeah, we've been reading it a lot, you're right. So Laura, I did look, and maybe Jan and Sean, you can help me with this. So, with that change in the law for commercial and industrial, right now, Clarinda sits at 14.6% combined industrial and commercial. And I remember looking somewhere and seeing state comparisons, and that's why I was thinking that we were high. Is there a way to get state comparisons for kind of a rural community like ours, what the percentage of industrial and commercial is?
Well, I would say there's two things. One, Sean has one, but also you can look back last year at your certified budget.
Okay.
There's a tab there for C&I,
Okay.
and it will actually show the breakout and the amounts last year to this year. So there is a tab in the certified budget that's projected ahead for 22, but we don't have an yeah.
So, yeah, in the booklet, there is some information on taxable valuation, and I think it does break it out by the type, so to have industrial. And then on our website, it's not in the booklet, but we do have a listing of all the school districts in the state, so you can kind of compare yourself to what, how you look compared to other school districts. I will say the higher that your commercial and industrial valuation is, 14, I'm not sure where that would rank, but I know like West Des Moines is really high. I think Burlington is really high. They're really going to be impacted because their percentage is very high. 14%, I'm not sure what that's going to look like compared to other districts, but it is going to have an impact on your tax rate.
It is, and I think about when you, one of the other conversations we've had a lot is, you can't always compare your district story is your district story for your town. And so even if someone's next door, if they don't have the same, this would be just one example, it's going to look different. So you can't compare exactly from one district to the next.
That's why when I always did my comp groups, we always showed the levy by piece, because I had compadres who had zero debt, so they had this really low tax rate. I was like, well, that's great, but they have no debt, and we had all this debt. So I think it's important to look at pieces of the levy, the general fund versus the, really to look at those pieces from a comparability standpoint.
And I think that's the learning we've been wanting to have, or we've started the last couple of years, even in our negotiations, is, if this is our story, we have to look at our story and where our money's coming from, where it's going out, that kind of thing. So, thank you.
What year did you say that, commercial industrial?
23 is the finality.
Yeah.
So even this year, there's not as much because they were ratcheting it down, but it's gone in 23.
Okay.
So in terms of the legislature, I've been keeping up on all the bills and things going through, but have you heard a lot about AEA flow-through changing, or let's start there, Sean.
So there was a bill that was introduced at the very end of session last year that basically changed the way AEAs are funded. I'm not sure they're going to change the flow-through piece of it. There still would be that, because AEAs can't levy property taxes, so school districts have to levy the property taxes on their behalf. I haven't seen a bill this session yet, not to say there won't be one that would change the way the AEAs are funded, but I'm not sure anything's going to happen there.
Okay, that's good to know. It's been a conversation that I know we've had at some of our superintendent meetings. I think my other question is, have you had any conversation about the bill that or a proposal about using your management fund for either or? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so
speak to that, please.
Good question. So the management fund's a little bit of a sore subject area with the legislature. It's kind of one of the levies that school districts are using to kind of make sure, that they manage their overall tax levy rate. So what's happened over time is management fund balances have ballooned. When I have a file that shows from fiscal year 2010 on a statewide basis, the management fund balance was $110 million. It is now over $330 million. So it looks like, there would be ability for school districts to be able to, if the uses were expanded, it would help them lower their management fund balances. But the legislature's thought is they really oppose, they don't like property taxes at all.
Right.
So getting additional uses for management fund or other property taxes is very difficult. Just because they believe that if they allow for added uses, the property tax amounts are gonna go up. So, yes, there are bills that are gonna be introduced. I saw one that has SRO officers can be used.
There's one for, I think,
That's not
loan-
going anywhere.
Loan forgiveness for teacher recruitment and retention for the teacher shortage.
Yeah.
It's the one that I know in Southwest, that's in Southwest Iowa.
Yeah, so I think it's a good idea, but anytime you say we're gonna use a management fund for it, it's probably not gonna go anywhere.
Well, and that's what they thought is not using, at that legislative copy when we like proposed some conversation, not saying you could use it for both, but maybe one or the other. I don't know. So just wondered if you'd heard anything on that.
You brought up a point about telling your story though, Chris, and that's important with the management fund too, and that's some of the questions the legislators ask. So if your management fund is a healthy balance, as long as you have rationale for it, like you're building it up to have an early retirement in 2 years or something like that, or maybe that consistent tax rate is so important to your district that you're building up the management fund so that when you can't do the cash reserve levy, you do the management fund, and then when you can do the cash reserve, then you lower the levy. Just have to be able to tell your story.
Thank you. And then just for the board to know, Nancy and I are going to a couple different budget workshops here in the near future. You want to tell them which ones we're headed to?
Tuesday, we'll be heading to Creston to work with Larry Siegel for budget workshop. And then the next day, which is a board meeting, I'm heading to Ames. That's part of my SBO training for budget. And I believe there's another one in February 15th and 16th that's in Altoona that Chris and I are headed to.
Any other questions from the folks? It was a lot of information. It was good information. I guess if not, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for
Thank you.
being
Thank
here.
you.
Need any food recommendations? There's like you could drive all over and stuff. Thank you very much. Dan, thank you. Tom, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Jim.
No.
Jim. Will you see Phil? Pardon? Will you see Phil?
You didn't have any other
He's just got a cap.
jobs? Okay. Yeah, 'cause I.
Just wondering if he was, I didn't know if he was in now or. Okay.
It was until.
Okay, well, that's kind of what I wondered, is how we on foot.
I guess, any other discussion after that from the board? Yeah, I'm sure we'll bring up questions later.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, if not, our next meeting will be Wednesday, the 26th, and it is at 6 p.m. And it's here at the boardroom. 6 p.m. Yep. All right, entertain a motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded, we adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thanks.
Also, you'll receive.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Greg.